It was the summer of 2003, and I had just turned 17. My grandfather, a man who had spent his life as a carpenter, felt it was time to teach me some of his outdoor skills. He believed every person should know how to survive in the wild, so when he suggested a camping trip in the remote woods of northern Minnesota, I eagerly agreed. I had always looked up to him for his strength and wisdom. At 65, he still moved with the energy of someone much younger, his hands weathered from years of hard work and his voice steady, full of quiet confidence. I knew spending a week in the wilderness with him would be memorable, even if it seemed a bit old-fashioned. We packed lightly, just the basics: a tent, sleeping bags, a first aid kit, a small propane stove, canned food, and a couple of knives. My grandfather insisted on bringing a rifle for safety, though I doubted we'd need it. We planned to camp near a large, isolated lake, around 20 miles from the nearest road. It wasn't a well-known spot, which suited us perfectly. The goal was to escape the noise of the world, enjoy nature, and test our survival skills. We reached the trailhead on a bright afternoon. The hike to the campsite was about 5 miles through dense forest, with the air thick and humid, and the mosquitoes relentless. But the promise of the peaceful lake kept us moving. The trail was hardly a trail at all, more like a faint outline through towering pines and thick underbrush. I followed my grandfather closely, admiring how he moved with the ease of someone who had spent his life in the woods. When we finally reached the lake, the view was breathtaking. The water was still, reflecting the trees and sky like a perfect mirror. There wasn't another soul in sight. We found a flat spot near the shore to set up camp, and as we worked, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the water. By the time we finished, the only light came from our small campfire and the stars above. The first night passed quietly. We cooked some canned stew over the fire, chatted about random things, and then went to bed early. The silence of the forest was overwhelming. No cars, no voices, just the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an owl. It took me a while to fall asleep, but when I did, I slept deeply. The second day proved more challenging. We spent the morning fishing, but the lake didn't give up much. By noon, the clouds rolled in, and the air grew heavy. My grandfather suggested we gather extra firewood in case it rained, so we spent hours collecting fallen branches and cutting them into manageable pieces. As we worked, I began to notice how isolated we were. The forest seemed denser than it had the day before, the trees almost closing in on us. That night, the rain came. What started as a light drizzle quickly turned into a downpour. The sound of it hitting the tent was deafening, and I began to feel uneasy for no clear reason. My grandfather seemed unaffected, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Maybe it was just the storm playing tricks on my mind. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the forest was soaked. The trail we had hiked in on had turned into a muddy mess, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth. We decided to stay around camp, drying out our gear and trying to catch some fish. That's when I noticed something strange. About 50 yards from our campsite, near the forest's edge, there were tracks in the mud. They weren't animal prints. They were boot prints. At first, I thought they might be ours from the day before, but the more I looked, the more I realized they couldn't be. The prints were too fresh, and they didn't follow the trail we had taken. They came from deeper in the woods and stopped near the water's edge. I showed the tracks to my grandfather, who studied them for a moment before shrugging them off. "Probably just a hunter passing through," he said, but I couldn't stop thinking about those tracks. Who else would be out here in the middle of nowhere during a storm, and why had they come so close to our camp? The rest of the day passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That night, as we sat by the fire, I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the darkness for any signs of movement. My grandfather must have noticed because he handed me the rifle and told me to keep it nearby. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. At first, I didn't understand why the tent was so dark, and the forest outside felt eerily still. I lay there, listening to my heart pounding in my chest. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like footsteps, coming from the direction of the lake. I reached over and shook my grandfather awake. He listened for a moment, then grabbed the rifle. Without a word, he unzipped the tent and stepped outside. I followed, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim orange glow across the campsite. The footsteps had stopped, but the air felt heavy, as if something was watching us. My grandfather scanned the area with the rifle, but there was nothing. After a while, we went back to the tent, but neither of us slept much. The next morning, we decided to pack up and leave early. The forest didn't feel the same anymore. It was as if the trees were closing in on us, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. As we hiked back to the trailhead, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following us. When we finally reached the car, I felt a wave of relief. As we loaded our gear into the trunk, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Stuck to the back of the car was a single muddy boot print. I had been working the night shift for years, but this time felt different. It was 2015, and I was 29. I was assigned to monitor a construction site deep in the Appalachian forest. The company had decided it was more cost-effective to have someone on site around the clock to prevent theft or vandalism. The project had stalled due to legal issues, so for months, my only task was to stay in a camper and keep watch. It wasn't a bad gig, quiet with plenty of time to myself. That night, the rain began just after sunset. Heavy drops hammered the roof of the camper, creating a constant hum that should have been soothing. But the wind howled through the trees, and the rain blurred the outside world beyond the small windows. It felt isolating, as if I were the only person left on Earth. I had parked the camper on a gravel patch near the construction site, with the woods surrounding me on three sides. Beyond the trees was nothing but miles of dense forest. The site itself was a large clearing, slick with mud from the rain, filled with half-built structures, stacks of lumber, and scattered heavy machinery. My job was simple: do perimeter checks every few hours and report any problems. Easy, right? By 9 p.m., the storm had picked up. The wind was so powerful it rocked the camper, and the lights flickered occasionally, but the generator held steady. I sat in the tiny kitchen, eating leftover food and listening to the crackling radio. The nearest town was over an hour away, and there was no cell signal out here. The isolation was both a blessing and a curse. Around 10 p.m., I decided to do my first check. I grabbed my flashlight and rain jacket, then stepped out into the storm. The cold rain hit me hard, soaking through my clothes in seconds. The flashlight barely pierced the downpour, making everything look distorted and strange. I walked the perimeter, my boots sinking into the mud with each step. Everything seemed normal. No signs of trespassing, no wildlife, just the relentless rain and wind. But as I headed back to the camper, I noticed something strange. One of the heavy tarps covering the lumber piles had come loose, flapping violently in the wind. I hurried over to secure it, but as I got closer, I saw footprints in the mud. They were fresh, leading away from the tarp and into the woods. My stomach tightened. The prints were human, too large to be anything else, and they hadn't been there earlier. I pointed my flashlight toward the tree line, but the rain made it almost impossible to see. I told myself it was probably just someone from the site who had been here earlier and forgot to mention it, but deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. I was supposed to be the only one here that night. Back in the camper, I locked the door and double-checked the windows. My heart raced, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was out there. I tried to focus on the radio, but every creak of the camper and every gust of wind made me jump. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting it to burst open. At midnight, I forced myself to go out for another round. Staying inside felt safer, but I couldn't ignore my duties. I grabbed the flashlight again and stepped outside. The rain had slowed slightly, but the air was colder now, and the woods seemed darker, more ominous. As I walked the perimeter, I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. I kept the flashlight low, scanning the ground for any new tracks, but the mud had turned into a soupy mess, making it impossible to tell. Halfway through my check, I heard something, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It wasn't the rain or the wind. It was deliberate, like someone knocking on wood. I froze, trying to pinpoint the direction, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Then, it stopped, leaving only the hiss of rain and the rustling of leaves. I waited, my heart pounding, but the noise didn't return. I hurried back to the camper, my nerves on edge. I locked the door again and sat at the tiny table, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks, but the unease didn't go away. I felt exposed, like someone was watching me. By 2 a.m., the storm had turned into a steady drizzle. I decided to do one final check before settling in for the night. The rain had washed away most of the mud, but when I reached the tarp-covered lumber pile, my blood ran cold. The footprints were back. This time, there were more of them, dozens crisscrossing around the site, leading in and out of the woods. I scanned the area with my flashlight, my breath fogging in the cold air. Something moved at the edge of the tree line, a shadow quick and low to the ground. I swung the flashlight toward it, but there was nothing there. My pulse hammered in my ears. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but the camper was my only shelter, and the truck was parked too far away. Inside the camper, I barricaded the door with a chair and sat by the window, clutching a kitchen knife. The rain had stopped, leaving an eerie silence. Hours passed, but I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing faint noises outside, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. Every sound reminded me that I wasn't alone. As dawn approached, the sky lightened just enough to see. The clearing looked empty, but the footprints were still there, more defined in the soft light. They led away from the camper, back into the woods. I debated leaving, but my shift ended at 8 a.m., and I didn't want to explain to my boss why I'd abandoned my post. At 7 a.m., I stepped outside, clutching the flashlight even though I didn't need it anymore. I followed the footprints to the edge of the woods, stopping just short of the tree line. The forest felt alive, every shadow and movement a potential threat. I didn't dare go any further. When my replacement arrived, I didn't mention the footprints or the noises. I didn't want to seem paranoid or incompetent. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something I couldn't explain. Whoever or whatever had been out there, they had been watching me all night and they knew I was there. It was late September of 2018 when my friend Kevin and I decided to go camping. We had been working out together for a few years, and our friendship went beyond the gym. Kevin was a tough, no-nonsense cop, and he had a way of convincing me to do things I wouldn't usually consider. This camping trip was one of those things. He wanted to go deep into the woods to disconnect and push ourselves. It wasn't just a typical camping trip. Kevin wanted to go without much gear, just us, a tent, and nature. He assured me he knew the area, an isolated spot in the woods of Pennsylvania where he had camped before. It was far from any marked trails, and Kevin promised it would be quiet. We packed light: a tent, sleeping bags, a portable stove, some canned food, and water filters. Kevin also brought his service pistol, saying it was for safety. I thought it was a bit much, but I didn't argue. After all, he was a cop. The drive to the forest took us nearly 3 hours. The road kept narrowing as we got closer, eventually turning to gravel. Finally, Kevin parked at a small, unmarked clearing. From there, we had to hike another 2 hours to get to his ideal spot. The hike was tough. The air was crisp, and the leaves were beginning to turn shades of red and yellow. At first, I enjoyed the view, but as we went deeper into the woods, the trees grew thicker, and the silence felt eerie. Kevin led the way, calm and sure of himself, while I struggled to keep up. We finally reached a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. The place felt untouched, like no one had been there in years. Kevin set up the tent while I gathered firewood. By the time the sun began to set, we had a nice fire going. We ate quietly, listening to the faint rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. The isolation was both calming and unsettling. Kevin seemed perfectly fine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching us. I brushed it off as paranoia. After all, this was my first time camping so far off the grid. That first night, I woke to a strange sound. At first, it was just distant branches snapping. I lay still, listening closely. The sound grew louder, closer, until it became unmistakable footsteps. I nudged Kevin, but he was already awake. He put a finger to his lips, signaling me to be quiet. The footsteps stopped just outside the tent, and my heart pounded so loudly I thought whoever, or whatever, was out there could hear it. Kevin slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. He didn't say anything, but his body stiffened. After a few minutes, he zipped the tent back up and whispered, "Probably just an animal. Go back to sleep." I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, Kevin acted like nothing had happened. I followed his lead, trying to shake off the unease from the night before. We spent the day exploring the area, hiking to a nearby stream to refill our water bottles. As we were walking back to camp, Kevin stopped suddenly and pointed to the ground. There, we saw a trail of bare human footprints. They weren't ours, and they didn't look old. Kevin's expression changed. He scanned the area, his hand resting on his holstered pistol. "Let's head back," he said. When we got back to camp, nothing seemed out of place, but Kevin insisted we keep the fire going all night, even during the day. He didn't say anything, but I could tell he was just as rattled as I was. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they circled the tent. Kevin grabbed his pistol and whispered for me to stay inside. He unzipped the tent and stepped out, leaving me alone. I could hear him moving around, the crunch of leaves under his boots, then silence. Nothing but my own breathing. After what felt like an eternity, Kevin returned. He didn't say much, only that he didn't see anything. But his face was pale, and his hands were shaking. We decided to pack up and leave. Kevin didn't argue when I suggested it, which was unusual for him. As we were breaking down the tent, I noticed something carved into one of the nearby trees. A crude drawing of a human figure. I pointed it out to Kevin, and he muttered something under his breath. He didn't say what he thought it meant, but his urgency to leave intensified. The hike back to the truck felt longer than it should have. Every noise and movement in the trees made me jump. Kevin stayed ahead, his pistol out, constantly scanning the area. When we finally reached the truck, I felt a wave of relief until I saw the windshield. It was cracked, like someone had hit it with a rock or a bat. Kevin cursed under his breath and checked the rest of the truck. Nothing else seemed damaged, but the sight of that shattered glass sent chills down my spine. The drive home was tense. Neither of us said much, and Kevin kept checking the rearview mirror, like he expected someone to be following us. When we got back to town, we parted ways without much conversation. Kevin told me he'd report the incident to his department, but I never heard any updates. A few weeks later, I looked up the area where we had camped. I found a few news articles about disappearances in the region, hikers and campers who had vanished without a trace. One article mentioned strange symbols carved into trees near their last known locations. I haven't gone camping since. That afternoon at Elk Stream, I was 14. My family and I were on a camping getaway at a popular site in southern Washington. It was the summer of 2006, and the stream was known for its natural rock slides. Smooth, polished stones guided the water like a ready-made amusement park ride. My parents had learned about it from some friends, and the idea of a natural water park made it a must-visit spot for our trip. The day began perfectly. The sunlight filtered through towering fir trees. The air was warm but not stifling, and the chilly stream water was just the refreshment we needed. The sound of rushing water bounced off the rocks, mingling with occasional bird songs and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. The slides were bustling with families and kids like us, laughing and splashing as they glided down the slippery rocks. My younger brother, Ben, who was 9, couldn't get enough of it. He kept challenging me to race him down the slides to see who could go faster. My mom and dad were settled on a flat rock farther upstream, chatting with other adults and snacking, while I mostly stayed in the water, sliding over and over. The stream wasn't deep, up to my waist in most places, but the current was stronger than it appeared. First, it was all fun. I would slide down, land in the lower pool, and climb back up to do it again. The rush of flying down the slick rocks, water spraying around me, was thrilling. Within minutes, I was drenched, but the sun's warmth made it comfortable. After a few hours, the crowd began to thin. Families packed up, leaving the area quieter. My parents were still chatting, and my brother had joined some other kids to build a makeshift dam. I decided to linger in the water a bit longer. The coolness was soothing after so much sliding and climbing. I floated at the base of the slide, letting the gentle current nudge me around the calm pool. The water at the bottom of the slide was still, but farther downstream, the current quickened. I hadn't really noticed where the stream flowed, assuming it was more rocks and shallow pools like the rest of the area. But as I drifted toward the edge of the pool, I felt the pull of the current grow stronger. I kicked my legs to push myself back toward the slide, but the rocks beneath the water were smooth and slick, offering no grip. The current tugged harder, inching me downstream. I told myself it was fine, I just needed to swim harder. But as I paddled, my arms began to ache, and a sinking panic set in. I wasn't making any progress. The water grew louder as the stream narrowed. I looked downstream and saw something that made my stomach drop. A waterfall. It wasn't just a small drop. The water surged over a steep cliff, plunging into the void below. White foam churned at the edge, and my heart froze. I had no idea how far the drop was, but it looked high, too high. The current pulled me faster now, and I scrambled, clawing at the rocks around me. My hands scraped against the slick surface, but I couldn't find anything to hold on to. My feet couldn't grip either. I shouted, but the roar of the water swallowed my voice. My family was too far upstream to hear me. As I neared the edge, I spotted a branch hanging low over the water. It wasn't thick, but it looked sturdy. Instinctively, I lunged for it, stretching out my arms. My fingertips brushed the branch, then latched onto it. The current tugged at my body with fierce force, sending pain through my arm as I clung to the branch. For a moment, I was sure it would snap. The wood creaked and shifted under my weight but didn't break. I summoned every ounce of strength left in me and pulled myself toward the shore. My legs thrashed against the current as I inched onto the rocks. Finally, I collapsed on solid ground, gasping for air, my limbs trembling from the effort. For a moment, I sat there, staring at the waterfall just a few feet away. The water thundered down into a misty abyss, the bottom out of sight. If I'd gone over, I wouldn't have made it. As the shock set in, I stood on unsteady legs, wobbling as I made my way back upstream, hugging the rocky bank this time. When I reached my family, they were still where I had left them, completely unaware of what had just happened. My brother waved at me, and my parents smiled as if everything was fine. I didn't tell them. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to scare them or ruin the day. Or maybe I just didn't want to relive it. But for the rest of the trip, I couldn't stop picturing that waterfall. I kept seeing myself going over, disappearing into the mist below. Even now, years later, I can still feel the current's pull, the raw panic in my chest, and the rough texture of that branch in my hands. It was the closest I've ever come to dying, and no one even knew. It was late June, and my girlfriend, Lisa, and I had planned a camping trip with her family in the hills of northern New Mexico, near a small town called Cedar Valley. The area was famous for its thick woods, rugged cliffs, and narrow, winding trails. About 14 years earlier, during my college years, I had an experience in Navajo land in Utah that I still couldn't explain. It left me with a strange, lingering feeling, like a shadow of something sinister that I couldn't quite shake. A Navajo friend of mine back then had said very little about it, but seemed to understand. All he told me was to trust my instincts if I ever felt that way again. When we arrived at the campsite, the atmosphere was serene. Lisa's family was lively and cheerful, busy setting up tents, cooking over a campfire, and chatting as the sun dipped behind the hills. Lisa had always had trouble with her appetite and often used cannabis to help her eat. Since that wasn't something she could do openly around her family, we decided to sneak away later for some privacy. After dinner, we hopped into my truck and headed down a quiet road that curved through the hills. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fresh pine, and the road was narrow, with a steep drop-off on one side and dense forest on the other. Eventually, we came across a small overlook with a pull-off. The parking area was empty, bordered by scattered trees and thick underbrush on one side, with a clear view of the valley below on the other. From there, I could make out the dim lights of distant farms and the faint glow of the town. Felt remote, but not dangerously so. Lisa prepared her pipe while I leaned back in my seat, taking in the peaceful night. But as the minutes passed, an odd uneasiness crept over me. At first, it was barely noticeable, just the faint prickling sensation of hairs standing on end. Then it grew heavier, like a static charge buzzing over my skin. I tried to shrug it off, chalking it up to paranoia and the eerie quiet of the forest at night. Then I heard it, a faint rustling in the brush to our left, where the trees were thickest. At first, it was subtle, like the sound of an animal moving through tall grass. I thought it might be a deer or maybe a raccoon, but as the noise continued, I noticed a pattern. It sounded deliberate, too steady to be an animal. I glanced at Lisa, but she seemed relaxed, caught up in her own thoughts. I didn't want to alarm her, so I kept my focus on the dark woods, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But the sound persisted, growing closer, and its cadence was unmistakably human. Then I saw it. A shadow shifted at the edge of the lot. It was tall, upright, and slowly making its way uphill toward us. My pulse quickened, and memories of that night in Utah years ago flooded back. My hand hovered over the keys in the ignition as I tried to process what I was seeing. The figure stopped just at the tree line, partially hidden by the shadows. Before I could react, Lisa spoke, breaking the silence. She said she thought she heard footsteps on the pavement. My stomach turned. Then I heard it too clear, deliberate steps on the asphalt, coming from the opposite side of the lot. There were two sets of footsteps, one in the brush, one on the pavement, both getting closer. Instinct kicked in. I turned the key and the engine roared to life. Throwing the truck into reverse, I backed out of the lot, tires skidding on the gravel, and sped down the road without looking back. The headlights cut through the darkness as my hands gripped the wheel tightly. Lisa sat in stunned silence beside me. The drive back to the campsite felt like an eternity. Every shadow along the road made me flinch. Every rustle in the trees set my nerves on edge. When we finally pulled up, Lisa's family was gathered around the fire, laughing and roasting marshmallows, completely unaware of what had just happened. For the next 2 nights, I hardly slept. Each time the wind rustled the trees, I thought of those footsteps, of that shadow moving toward us. I replayed the events over and over in my mind, trying to make sense of them. If it had been animals, they wouldn't have moved like that. Black bears don't walk upright for that long, and no other creatures in these hills could explain what we saw. If it had been people, their behavior was even more unsettling. 2 strangers approaching a parked truck in the middle of nowhere at night couldn't have had good intentions. But the most chilling thought of all was the one I couldn't dismiss. What if it wasn't human? That trip left me with a newfound respect for the wilderness, and a reminder that, out there, you're never truly alone.